talk to us about your subject.
Okay, perfect. So I was wondering how many students are in here? Right. And then how many people have no idea what a cultural landscape is? And be bold, it's honest, just be honest. All right, otherwise you're all experts at cultural landscape. Okay, so how about if I tell you a little bit about what a cultural landscape is then? All right. So a cultural landscape is essentially any built environment from ancient times to today. So how many cultural landscapes do you think you went through just this morning? Depending on where you lived, to the west, to the south, to the north, probably quite a few. You've probably gone through quite a few just being on this campus. So what I mean is the layers of history, how this used to be forest, Downer College, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. As new layers come on, there's new, I'll say, residual, physical, as well as social. Okay? So I've been basically teaching about cultural landscapes for decades now. So I thought to help anybody who may not know about training in cultural landscapes, I'm just going to give you an example of mine. So basically I went to 2-year ag and tech school, and I learned a lot about bugs and soil and plants, and a little bit about design. Then I transferred. I'm from New England, and so I tell my students that I needed a couple of mountain ranges between my parents and myself at that point in time. So I went out to Utah from New England, and that was essentially like an undergraduate landscape architecture program. And so I learned a lot more about design and analysis, planning, etc. And then I got a job in Boston, and I got my license in landscape architecture and worked. After doing that for a few years, I realized that I really liked historic preservation because I came from a New England town that was like the classic thing. Town green, church, school, everything there, right? So this was what was in my mind of what a historic landscape is, or what historic preservation is. So why did I go to Georgia? Georgia had actually a very long history and a legacy of teaching about historic landscapes and cultural landscapes. So I wanted to learn from those professors. So those are a few that are listed there. I was very fortunate to get an internship exchange from the US ICMOS, and I went to Poland and essentially worked for their version of the National Park Service. So I began to learn about international cultural landscape and history. And then I also was very fortunate to have worked in the National Park Service for a while, both in the Atlanta office and in the Washington, D.C. office. And then I went into teaching. And I tell people that it is genetic because my grandmother, my uncle, my mother, my sister, and I are all teachers of different ages. So I was at Clemson first, primarily teaching landscape architecture. And really only one semester did I have an opportunity to teach in the College of Charleston, Clemson graduate program in historic preservation. And I really liked the teaching of preservation and getting back to that. And so I basically decided to, in quotes, come home, University of Georgia, where there was a long legacy of teaching cultural landscape. And I've been teaching in the preservation program ever since. Helped create something called the Cultural Landscape Lab. We, at one point in time, proposed a cultural landscape degree because there had been so much pressure about 4 or 5 years ago, or a little bit longer. That unfortunately was not put forward because we weren't cranking out as many as the business school would. And we also have a grad and undergrad landscape certificate in cultural landscapes. And probably the highest number of cultural landscape courses that are offered anywhere in the country at any kind of preservation school. So this is more a reminder than anything for the educators in the room. Of course, we have the historic preservation professional qualifications. Those were created as a part of the National Historic Preservation Act, 1966, and they were amended a few different times. Finally, in 2014, we have 12 professions: archaeology, architectural history, conservation, cultural anthropology, curation, engineering, folklore, historic architecture, historic landscape architecture, historic preservation planning, historic preservation, and history, that all have very detailed definitions of what qualifications one must have to do this kind of work. So I'm going to move right to historic landscape architecture. So they always have a definition: the practice of applying artistic and scientific principles to the research, planning, design, and management of both the natural and built environments, with specialized training in the principles, theories, concepts, methods, and techniques of preserving cultural landscapes. So minimally, you have to have a professional degree or a state license to practice landscape architecture, plus you need 2 years of full-time professional experience in landscape architecture and products that demonstrate that you also know preservation, okay? Hopefully you have a graduate study or undergraduate study in that, but hopefully it gives you practical experiences to do this work, okay? They also are very clear to say things that, like, landscape architecture is typically, like architecture, a course of study that doesn't always focus on history, so you have to have extra experience in historic preservation to add to that. So this is kind of where I'm coming from what the standards say a historical landscape architect should have to do work. So when I got into academia in 2005, I was, of course, thinking of all this. I had private practice work, I had public practice work, and there was a book that came out, The Olmsted Center and the Growth of Historic Landscape Preservation. That came out in 2007, so a couple years after I'd started. It really focused literally on a specific national park because it was the first one that actually dealt with historic landscapes or cultural landscapes. And it also was talking about how the concept of the field had grown, but it was really only looking at through the federal eye. And honestly, my questions were, what about all those other folks that actually influenced before the feds noticed it and then did something about it? So there were a lot of associations and organizations that there were very active volunteers doing things. A lot of landscape architecture practitioners were actually helping to create what the field was. Academics in universities that were interested in it, working with practitioners, working with the Park Service, and then state and local governments actually were doing this kind of thing, the SPOs, and then a whole bunch of other people that have not been acknowledged. So I had an opportunity to write a little article about this pretty soon after I started, and it was published, and I didn't realize what an awesome honor it was to be in the very first volume of Preservation Education and Research. So those questions I was asking at that time were kind of broad. Part of it was I had just started teaching and I wanted to figure out who are my people? Who else is teaching this kind of thing? All right. So I wanted to know, are landscape architecture and historic preservation students being taught the basics of cultural landscape philosophy and methods? Who's teaching it? How's it being taught? And has there been, or is there a need to identify specifically a course of study? So I looked at a bunch of programs, landscape architecture and historic preservation programs, and did telephone surveys. This was 2007. So 30 to 6-minute durations, looked at websites. Yes, we had websites then. And then did a whole bunch of emails requesting, and then I did interviews for quite some time. So everyone was asked name, title, department, what their areas of expertise, et cetera, were. But I was very specific about the kinds of questions that I asked those that were teaching in landscape architecture versus those that were teaching in preservation. So in landscape architecture, I wanted to know about what I thought were pretty standard classes that were happening. Landscape architecture history, professional practice, construction, site analysis, if there were any specific faculty that were interested in or had trained in historic landscapes or landscape preservation. Were there any landscape preservation courses, documentation courses? What's the student interest? Have any of those students been placed? And then ask for like general questions. I did ask about design studios, encourage them to speak about that. For preservation, those classes that taught about HP philosophy, professional practice, preservation technology, how to inventory, evaluate, and treat preservation resources, again, faculty interest, any specific landscape preservation and or documentation coursework, student interest, student placement. So at that time, and I wouldn't say that this was just at that time, it literally is how it grew over time. Basically, there were 4 ways that people were learning about cultural landscapes. In the beginning, 1966 or earlier and on, it pretty much was self-study. And you would rely on organizations like the National Park Service to learn. So if they had workshops, typically in person, because early on we didn't have access through email, so a lot of it was through newsletters and publications and things like that. If you were really lucky, you had some kind of work experience under somebody who was either a federal, state, or local agency in government, or a private firm, a landscape architecture firm that was doing this kind of work. Or because there were a few people teaching, you were in an academic program, either landscape or preservation, that were teaching this kind of thing. So that really was pretty much what was happening at that point in time, okay? So at that time, and because of the book, I basically started what I'll call my third lifetime project for research in who are the leaders in cultural landscape and developing the field. And this idea of like who else is doing the work beyond the federal government. I wanted to talk to organizations. I wanted to talk to people who've been in private practice, in state government, in the Park Service, et cetera. So this is a list of the almost 50 people that I've already done oral history interviews with a very robust number of questions. And so I've learned a few things that I had no clue of in 2007 and 2008 when I did that initial focus on academic research. So in trying to revisit those questions now, I'm basically saying kind of past, present, future. In what ways have we, do we, and can we educate? And I say broadly preservation professionals about cultural landscapes, not just landscape architecture and historic preservation students, okay? And then again, organizations, what institutions are doing it, who's doing it, and how. And here I have kind of the comment of first generation, second generation, or third generation of cultural landscape professionals, because we've definitely had a roll past of the first generation of people retire. We're kind of coming into the second generation of people retiring and moving into the third generation of people retiring. So this is kind of a quick summary of the things that I learned from talking to people for the past 20 years. Is when a few key organizations were being established pretty quick after the National Historic Preservation Act, those groups were very, very influential in not just training and getting people together and talking about, but actually able to kind of spin off interest groups. So Association of Preservation Technology, one of the earliest ones, created in 1968. And a lot of that was about building technologies, a little bit about trades, but there were some people that kept going to these conferences that were really interested in landscape and weren't quite finding what they needed all the time at these APT conferences. So about a decade later, they begrudgingly, because they didn't want to become an organization, created an organization called the Alliance for Historic Landscape Preservation. And I can remember the first time that I went to that, I was like, I found my people, my people. So they have annual meetings. They're usually pretty small, but they're all over the country. They do have student scholarships to attend and present. And they have done things like not only support student scholarship, and they're very, very interdisciplinary. I remember going to one particular conference in Virginia where we had a gentleman who was looking at orchards, specifically apple orchards, and he knew heirloom fruits and all these things, which was really kind of uncommon early on. And we literally did a taste test with him. It was more rather than us tasting it, we basically blindfolded him and would hand him different apples. And he literally would not take the bite out, but he would just put his teeth in it. And depending on what the crunch was, how much juice was coming out of it, what the flavor was, he actually knew those plant materials so well that he could actually identify truly apples that you don't get in the grocery store, but things that are very locally specific. But he was that good at it. And I thought, again, I found my people. This is awesome. So anyway, they have been a fantastic organization, and they've done some education. They were getting grants to help educate state historic preservation officers and offices about the importance of cultural landscapes. If there were not National Register nominations coming out of a certain region or a certain state, they were kind of, I'll say kindly targeted to be provided a lot of information about what that was. And then also the American Society of Landscape Architects. So even though they started much earlier, really the preservation group within that started around the same time, a little bit later, the 80s, okay? So the interesting thing about that is they had a historic preservation interest group that as cultural landscape people wanted to learn what this stuff was, because they were getting more and more RFPs for historic renovations of parks and things like this. People didn't really know what was going on. And so this historic preservation interest group used to have half-day and day-long workshops before the ASLA official landscape architecture organization's meeting. What they found out is that there were more people going to the pre-conference than were actually attending the ASLA conference. So I'm going to assume purely for monetary reasons. They then integrated it into ASLA. But ever since, ASLA has been very, very proactive, even if it is in small fits and spurts, about training people about historic landscapes. Two other, I'll say, outside groups. One was the Campbell Center for Historic Preservation, a really important group early on to train. They primarily were looking at buildings and museum objects or collections, but they did have for a short time who I would call leaders today in the cultural landscape that were teaching one-off courses there. And then hopefully you've heard of the National Preservation Institute. They started around the same time. This one was actually created because they wanted to provide a consistent schedule of classes with any number of instructors that could prepare to teach it any number of times. So the cultural landscape classes are still taught and have gone from pre-COVID in person to not just online but pre-recorded lectures. I will have to say that they tend to focus on Section 106 and regulatory related to cultural landscape. There's a little bit of broad, but it's really about regulatory more than anything else. So the Park Service, major player, how this has been. So from the very kind of inception, 1980 to about 2000s, for those of you that don't know, the National Park Service has kind of two groups. One group that actually works with all the parks, and then one work that groups with, I'll call it everything else, but that means state government, local government, private practitioners, private historic site owners, to educate them about cultural things. So by, within the first decade, 1980 to 1990, on the park side, the parks are cut up into 7 regions across the country. They literally had not just a lead person in cultural landscapes, but somebody who was doing a lot of the documentation work. And that was a pretty major thing, to have not just 1 but 2 people in. So we have the same kind of thing with historic architecture, with museums, things like that. On the non-park side, they were doing kind of educational bulletins because they weren't sure how long they might be around, but they were trying to do a lot of education, okay? Park Service are really, really good at doing partnerships with universities to try and not only get the university faculty to lead on projects, but to then train students who are underneath the faculty. So there was this kind of inherent apprenticeship program that always was going on, okay? There were some private practitioners that were sometimes working with the Park Service, but sometimes not, and working with universities. And then there was actually quite a bit of international engagement about what historic landscapes were at that point in time. Kind of, I'll say, midpoint. There was, for any of those professional qualifications standards, the historic landscape architect, for all those other 12, every once in a while they would basically kind of do an assessment. What do the people that come in entry level, mid-level, and upper level, what gaps in knowledge might they have? And so about 98, 2000, there was this gap in knowledge report that was done. And I would say in general, it had to deal with, because a lot of the people who were in those positions came out of landscape architecture, they did not really have a lot of the preservation training. And so there was a lot that was related to that. Or cultural resources management in general, okay? But then a lot of it was also about administration and facilities and things like that. So one of the big things that came about with training was the development of the Historic American Landscapes Survey. I've always been very honored that I was a part of that process, but it is so wonderful to open up the website and see equal amounts of detailed documentation for how we do photography, how we do actual documentation on the ground, how we do write reports, etc. So, like the architects when they started, each of their states has a state organization, AIA Wisconsin, AIA Illinois. They usually had a designee or a small group that was designated for historic structures to like do inventory, that kind of thing. We basically followed that model when we created that same thing for landscape survey. Now, not every state has done it, either for architecture or for landscape architecture, but there are some states that have done a lot. California has done a lot. Georgia's done some. Then there's other states, Massachusetts, out in Arizona, have done quite a bit with it. So once we kind of come up to 2000 to 2020, of course it was really more about refining the process that we were using in landscape architecture and preservation. But a lot of it had to do with technologies and trying to just keep up to date on inventory systems, of course, GIS, that kind of thing. The interdisciplinarity and how important that is in landscape architecture and cultural landscapes was building and growing. On the Park Service side, it was really important that park facilities, the groups that took care of things, didn't just focus on the buildings or the archaeology anymore. That they actually took care of not just the natural resources as that's what the wilderness people do, but how do we take care of the cultural landscapes and actually getting line items of the fields, the orchards, the pastures, what that is. How do you take care of those as a cultural landscape? And then, of course, as climate change and environmental factors have come in, National Park Service have been very strong with that. And I would say in a lot of cases, the cultural landscape group within the Park Service was always kind of the first one taking on trying to address environmental change, trying to address climate change in a lot of ways. COVID obviously really forced us all to figure out some new things, and that one was really about getting your websites really up to snuff. If you have not looked at the National Park Service cultural landscape websites, they have done a fantastic job of educating the public about what they are. So I encourage you to look at that. And then having just spoken about 2 weeks ago to the lead of the cultural landscape program in the National Park Service, I'm going to say the current temporary approach to cultural resources is a little bit dismaying. It was relayed to me that about 25% of the cultural resource people had been lost, but in cultural landscapes it's been about 35%. There are some regions that do not have any people representing that have that expertise, but there might be one person who's an archaeologist who's suddenly doing architecture, museums, landscape architecture, and a few other things. But we're going to keep going. So another reason for kind of getting back to this research and trying to figure out what's going on and where are we is that that preservation interest group a couple of years ago approached a bunch of the cultural landscape educators and basically were asking, why aren't you doing anything? And we're like, we are doing things. But what was happening is a lot of landscape architecture firms were now being asked to have a heritage consultant or someone who knows cultural landscapes on their project team. And they were trying to then find people who have that kind of training to be on that project team. So I think the LA private practice firms really need cultural landscape training people desperately. The practitioners have been and are the primary vehicle for the most part for doing cultural landscape research, the cultural landscape inventories, cultural landscape reports. And the thing that I take away from this is that back in the 1980s to 2000s, we were really, really good at getting the word out to state and local governments that this kind of expertise is needed. I would say that we haven't been able to do the follow-through on the training side for the, in quotes, quantity. Now that we've created the demand, how are we actually going to fulfill the quantity, essentially? So, as I'm beginning to do the research again, I can say generally, increase in LA and HP programs, whether they're accredited through whatever organizations. I'm doing more looking at organizations and agencies that are outside of what that kind of earlier realm was. And of course, doing things through Zoom and online and various stuff like that. So that is very much in progress. But I want to talk a little bit about the evolution of skill sets, because in some cases, a lot of the base information is exactly the same. And a lot of it is technology. We always have to evolve, right? So we always had to do historic research that related to architecture. I'll say traditional landscape in kind of a general ecosystem way. Plants and kind of general understanding of history over time. What's happened is, as we've moved forward, we have specialties in history, environmental history, climate history, plant history, even heirloom plants and animals, right? Using the proper plants and animals to, say, a period site. You don't just go get Angus cows and put them on a property if they actually were never there. You try to find what was truly there so that you're doing it as accurately as possible for plant material, for animal, etc. So the kind of things that we're expected to know have broadened hugely. This is where the interdisciplinarity is absolutely critical all the way through. Analysis, historically it was kind of more what's the physical changes on the land, but we also know that physical changes could be just a one-off and someone just has a bulldozer and one day wants to move things around. but for the most part, it's influenced by social changes. And so how do you incorporate ethnography, social change, to answer why, the whys of some of those physical changes? And then we have to graphically represent that stuff. Historically, it was hand drawings, it was CAD, it was kind of conceptual drawings. Now, of course, it's all the software packages that you guys know and are learning. And so it's a new tool, but we're still trying to do the same kind of thing. And then writing. We've always had to do grants and report writing. The writing skills in general have reduced over the years. And I joke with students anyone have an idea of what I'm doing? Oh, I'm not looking up and observing my surroundings. I could hit that light pole. I could not know the slope is going down because I'm so engrossed in this thing that I don't actually connect to the planet. So, same 4 kind of general categories of the way that we are training, but there's reductions in certain things, and there's redirections of certain things. Okay? So, as I've said, who's looking for people with cultural landscape training? It's definitely the NPS historical landscape architects who are trying to hire people to do work or manage work. It's definitely the LA and the cultural resource management firms that are doing the work for the Park Service. It's the NGOs that are always in search of qualified consultants they can refer other people to. Okay? It's organizations that get asked all the time, do you have a list of qualified people, or the SHPOs? The thing with the SHPOs is, I don't know of more than maybe a handful that have or pretend to have somebody who has landscape-specific expertise. It's still very much reliant on architecture and archaeology. So the public and private challenges are about those SHPOs. The Park Service has probably been impacted for at least 1 generation. So how is that going to work in the meantime? And it's clear that the landscape architects and CRM practitioners need people during the academic challenges. I'm still in the process of trying to help answer this. It's unclear where cultural landscapes stand in the academic world. There are a few universities that have either centers for preservation that a portion of that is cultural landscapes or specifically cultural landscapes. A lot of these programs have single courses or half courses or a lecture in them about cultural landscape. So some of the questions I'm asking still are commenting that many of the mentors who played critical roles in kind of creating the field have retired or are about to retire, depending on what generation they are. So who's going to lead the field of preservation in the future, landscape preservation specifically, and then who's going to teach those future professionals? I think I kind of made it on time there. Are there any questions or thoughts? And you can stew on it a little while.
There's a question back there.
Yes?
So as UWM students, if someone is interested in this kind of stuff, what would you say is like the first step in kind of heading in that direction?
The first step I would say is go to the National Park Service website, and they have really fantastic educational pieces there. And then I would say any of these programs at State University of New York, Environmental Science and Forestry, has a Center for Cultural Heritage and Landscape. University of Pennsylvania has an urban heritage project, which a portion of the cultural landscape is done. University of Georgia, where I work, we've created a cultural landscape lab that's focused specifically on it. University of Massachusetts has a Heritage and Society Center, where a piece of that is the Cultural Landscapes Initiative. As far as I know, those are the biggest programs right now. And honestly, I think if you go to the Contact Me section of any of those, they absolutely would respond to you.
Thank you.
Our students are interested, and we have found a need for teaching not only in preservation program, not only National Register process, but amendment process. And how does amendment play into cultural landscape education?
It's a very big role. I actually teach that class in my in our program of analysis and assessment. And we have to educate students on what I call introductory landscape architecture thinking. It plays a really critical role, because especially if you think of the nominations in the 1960s and 1970s that has the building, I'm gonna say, floating in space. It's a great building. I wonder where it's gonna land. No idea where it's gonna land. But you don't have context. You know, even if it is a property that has been totally annihilated, at least you know the property's been totally annihilated. But there's probably a lot more stuff there that's kind of hidden under the grass, under the trees, under the topography, that you just have to do the work to actually do it. So whenever I think of how much nominations are just updated in general, and then updated for ethnography, archaeology, landscape, I think, ooh, you've got a few generations to do this, but it's pretty critical to tell the whole story. Because for the architecture students, for any building style that's been created, right, Queen Anne, mid-century, modern, whatever, there is a commensurate landscape design that is totally separate, that has its entire history. And that goes with city urban planning. It's a timeline. Everything is a timeline. It's just layers throughout.
Hello, thank you for the great presentation. So I want to share a little bit of experience. Most of us have a background in architecture and landscape architecture, and got to know cultural heritage in landscape architecture when we were doing the masters. And since then, our group changed to cultural heritage, and we came and had a history preservation masters again. And now we are doing a PhD in informatics, because the way we were looking to the cultural heritage and cultural landscapes was public awareness to digital games. So we are developing educational or serious games for cultural heritage, cultural landscapes, and I had a paper back in 2020, I guess, about cultural landscapes in Turkey. It was like about market gardens in Istanbul, which through the game we were trying to convey that value of that landscape to the people. And it was a perfect landscape. They are still using it as like local food source of food, and they're still using it for vegetables and everything. So yeah, that's another route in
Absolutely.
this area, and like totally changed our past in academia and everything. So
Yeah, and I've always thought that gaming was the perfect place to try and teach this, because if a lot of people are looking at things like Dungeons and Dragons or creating your own spaces, for some reason, a lot of the gamers seem to understand historic architecture. You can beg to differ, depending, whatever. But they pretty much understand the castles and the ruins and things to a degree. And then a lot of times it's this flat lake, just kind of whatever the computer creates, green space behind. But so I think you're dead on of a way to mass educate. Yeah, yes, sir.
Yeah, with regards to your slide about 25% of, cultural resources, 35. In the Midwest, that's way low.
Yeah.
I'm the historical architect for the Midwest region of the National Park Service, the HPP program.
Yes.
And
Thank you.
our staff went from 7 to me.
Right.
And on the HLA, so we lost our HLA, and the cultural resources side that deals with the parks lost all of their HLAs except one. So we have one historical landscape architect
Right.
for both cultural resources within the parks, and she helps me with the stuff that's
Yes,
outside the parks now.
Yeah, I've been talking with Susan Dolan, the head of the cultural landscape program, about what's the next step. And I would
Right.
say we're still in conversation.
There's gotta be something, yeah, and with the hiring freeze, there's nothing we can do unless they let us do interns, because we also lost both our summer interns that were
Right.
supposed to be here, and that may be a way that young people can
Right.
get in, because if we have a hiring freeze, if we are allowed to do interns, that we may take that $200 intern, decide we're gonna make it a $1,000 intern because we have no other way to get help.
Right.
And so that could be a way for students to at least dip their toes into it, and maybe the only way under this administration, if there's a hiring freeze for an extended period of time, going through the intern process or partnership agreements, like you mentioned, with
Yeah,
universities, maybe the only way to do something.
And I will give a shout out to the NCPE internship program, because
Yeah.
literally the increase in cultural landscape positions over the past 10 to 15 years has been exponential, as people were looking for conduits
Yeah.
to get people in and get experience.
Yeah, so look at the NCPE intern sites for summer internships, assuming we can have them, they're all over the country
Yeah.
in
So,
various fields.
I'm gonna say, that's the one I should have mentioned also, is you can find landscape architecture internships doing cultural landscape work in many of the regions of the National Park Service. So, NCPE internships. Any other questions? All right, thank you very much.
I-